to Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock from MCG Quantity Surveyors, the tax depreciation specialist. Now, we are speaking to a tax specialist today from an accounting background. We're talking to the wonderful Jeremy Iannuzzelli. We're talking about PAYG variations, what they are, why they're important for property investors, some of the considerations you need to make, how to estimate what tax you should be paying, and the pros and cons of setting this up. So essentially we're talking about, rather than having your employer take the standard amount of tax from your pay slip and potentially getting to the end of the financial year and getting a tax return, rather than the tax return at the end of the year, you estimate what tax you should be paying with all your deductions, and you can minimize the tax that's coming out of your pocket each week or each fortnight or month, depending on your pay cycle. Jeremy gives some amazing insights into why it can be beneficial and the pitfalls to look out for. It's an awesome interview for anyone that's considering a PAYG variation. And even as an investor, if you're not looking at it, it's good to understand the pros and cons of that. Here's Jeremy. Jeremy Iannuzzelli, thanks for joining me on Geared for Growth.
Mike, pleasure as always to have you. Well, not to have you, mate, for you to have me, and pleasure to have a chat, and looking forward to talking more about, the juicy stuff around tax.
Yeah, we've done a bit of collaboration, and I think whether you like it or not, I've basically signed you up for budget night for the next 100 years, and we always have fun dissecting that. But today, in sort of the tax time special or tax special for property investors, I want to talk about PAYG variations. Now, this as a topic is maybe not going to leap off the page or leap into the ears as something important, right? But in the environment that we're in, it's a critical thing for property investors to understand, I think. But can you give us an insight into what it actually is?
Yeah, so I think to really give people the insight of what it is, we've got to really start with a major origination of PAYG variations and when they became quite popular in what environment. So they've been around for a long time, and to put the definition to what a PAYG variation is, it's a form that you fill out with the tax office to estimate your taxable income in that given or chosen financial year that's coming, and then tax estimate is then produced on it. So for argument's sake, on $100,000 income, there might be $25,000 worth of tax that is withheld, leaving you with a net income of $75,000 throughout the year. When completing the PAYG variation form, which is a forward guidance of the estimate of your deductions or property-related expenses or things that can be claimed as a deduction to lower your taxable income, essentially, instead of you waiting to get a refund at the end of the financial year, that refund will be divvied up and sent to your employer, essentially, as a reduced amount of PAYG that they withhold, and you're getting less tax taken out on a fortnightly, weekly, or monthly payment cycle, depending on how your employer does it. So it's really to help with the cash flow, so you can maintain your expenses, maintain your lifestyle, maintain your your investments that you might have, so you're not having to wait at the end of the financial year to get potentially quite a large refund that otherwise could be utilised better throughout the year. So that's a bit of the crux, the definition of it. Going back to when people really started to use it quite heavily, and I saw it just post GFC. Our rates started to really rise, and that was in that Howard era as well, before rates started to come down in the 2010 onwards to where we saw in 22. But expenses and post GFC, things were quite high. Interest rates were high. I bought my first property, and interest rates at that stage were like 7.75%. So it was hard, and there was a lot of negative gearing. There was a lot of deductions, and people were paying lots of tax. My first salary was about $32,000, including super at that stage, and believe it or not, the tax on the tax on $32,000 at that stage was nearly about $7,500, $8,000. Now, put that in perspective, Mike, $8,000 tax today represents someone earning around about a $52,000, $54,000 income. So I was paying tax on $32,000 package, but earning, say, $20,000 to $25,000 potentially less than what someone's earning today. So it makes a major difference. And where PAYG variations came into play during that time was, as I said, costs, interest rates, expenses were quite high. People's cost of investment was quite high. So rather than eating baked beans throughout the year and waiting for their juicy $5,000 or $10,000 refund to come in at the end of the financial year when the tax return was done, that PYG variation would be lodged. The estimate of expenses or estimate of cost of investment would be included in the form, get sent to their employer, and their employer would reduce the tax that they withhold by, say, $200 a week. And therefore, the client was able to maintain and hold their investment. And that was very ripe through that 2007 through to about 2010 period. And then as interest rates started to come down, people didn't rely on a PYG variation as much to get them through the harder times. And they were happy to wait for their refund to be a juicy, fat amount at the end of the financial year to where it inversed. And in 2020 to 22, no one was getting refunds anymore. They were all starting to pay tax because of a heavily reduced interest rate. But now, and we come to where we are today in February of 2023, interest rates have shot up again. And all of a sudden, there is a bit of pain. There is a bit of pinch point out there for many people in the cost of funding their investment. And we're starting to have those conversations now for many clients who are struggling to make ends meet and struggling to maintain the cost of their investment. And that's where PYG variations come in handy to assist them hold their investments throughout the cycle and hopefully get through the other side without too much cash flow deficiency.
Yeah, because I guess the worst situation is someone being forced to sell a property, right? Because if they can just hold on to it, over time it'll be easier to hold on to. Like maybe interest rates will come down, but rents should increase. And if they're paying back some of their principal, perhaps their repayments will go down for that reason as well. So you don't want to be forced into a situation where you have to sell because the cost of getting in is so high and you miss out on those potential gains, right?
Absolutely, and that's always a topic when people have a chat with me and saying, Jeremy, we're really finding it hard. We start to explore the variation because, again, we all know, like you mentioned, longer we can keep these properties and hold it through the downward cycles, there is the positive upward on the other side. A couple of things that you need to really watch out for is you don't claim on or overestimate the expenses in your PYG variation. I see many clients get a little bit too greedy where their ambition turns into greed. And instead of putting $20,000 down for interest, they may just say, oh, I'll put in there 25 just in case. Council rates, they know 1,600. Oh, I'll put in there 2,400 just in case. All of a sudden, what that does is it then significantly, taints, underestimates, overestimates the position at the end of the financial year. And what they find themselves in is where their employer has unfortunately taken out not enough tax. So, for instance, they should have only, had a reduction of $200 a week. Their employer's given them the reduction of $500 a week because that's what the government letter has told them to do. And at the end of the financial year, the client is in a position where they're paying a tax bill at the end of the financial year, which could be sometimes more substantial as a burden than if they were just to have the right amount being withheld throughout the year. So I do urge anybody who does a PYG variation, yes, it is an estimate, but try to accurately estimate your forward guidance of expenses. It is very tempting to just add a couple extra $1,000 here and there, but it does add up over time. And you don't want to be left owing the tax office a substantial bill at the end because that might be detrimental to your own portfolio and to your own lifestyle as well.
I know just in general in my life, I'll commit to things, in 2 or 3 weeks' time because I'm sort of like that. Well, that's future me's problem. Like he'll have more time. He won't be busy. I'm busy now, right? But, you're not going to get in trouble from the tax office by overestimating your expenses, but you are just stealing from future you, right? Future you is going to have to pay that back.
Correct. And if you haven't got your buffers in place and then all of a sudden you're owing the tax office money and, they're not very kind with interest in the sense that if you do owe them money and you can't pay it back to them by a specified time, their interest rate's like 7 or 8% on a payment plan condition. So it is important that, you don't rob Peter to pay Paul because the piper always gets paid in the end.
Yeah, exactly. Now, when I first heard about these PAYG variations, I thought, oh, that's a novel thing, but, maybe this is sharing too much about my prior poor financial literacy. But like I assume a lot of Australians, the tax that is taken out is kind of like a forced way of saving, right? We get to tax time, we're like, yes, I got $2,000 back or $10,000 back. Now I can go and do the things that I want to do. Do you find that's a typical problem that you encounter with people? Is they're like, oh, well, we love tax time because normally we get some money back. So like if I'm doing this, like I can't rely on that sort of recurring cash injection at, July, August.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, many people look at their tax refund as a forced way of savings. And it's probably not a bad thing to consider because, sometimes with extra disposable income that you might have throughout the year, you'll spend it. But yeah, a lot of people do budget on their tax coming back to pay for large ticket items. However, with PAYG variations, again, really looking at the crux of it and making a financial savvy decision, it's actually a really good decision to make. Why? Because through the reduction of tax that you're having to pay on a fortnightly, monthly or weekly payment cycle, however your wage gets paid, if you're using those tax savings wisely, i.e. to be putting into an offset account, i.e. to make sure that you're budgeting for the expenses that are to come, so you're not having to borrow from a credit card or put many costs onto a credit card, you can actually profit from it quite a bit. But again, if you're doing a PAYG variation simply to maybe have a little bit more disposable income not getting used for the right purposes, it's terrible. I'd rather clients wait till the end of the financial year and get that one-off cash injection, because psychology is very important in these decisions, Mike. $200 a week is still, you say, $10,400 a year. It doesn't feel as bad spending $200 a week. But if someone provides you a $10,400 one-off cash injection, all of a sudden, oh, it looks really big. I don't want to touch it. I'm going to fight. I'm going to make sure I keep it. So I really try to test the client's psychology to find out who they are as a person. And that's when I'll make some recommendations and say, if we can budget, if we can live on a shorter string, let's do it. Because that $10,400 potential refund that you'll get will help you when we have it as a one-off cash injection. And that kind of gives you the momentum to kickstart, further savings or further budgeting.
That's a really good point, because you can't imagine someone getting, say, a $10,000 refund and going, all right, well, instead of investing that, I'm going to schedule once a week, I'm going to buy some takeaway or a pair of shoes or a T-shirt or a concert ticket, and I'm just going to extrapolate that over 12 months. That's a horrifying thought, right? Because that's real cash. It's a big sum. You can do something of value with it. But when it's trickling through, it has a different kind of value to you, right?
Correct. And it works in the many same ways, companies and dividends and all those other things, right? I try to say to clients when they say, I need my wage to go from 105 to 110, 120. I say, well, let's leave it at 105. And why don't we try to issue a dividend of $10,000 or $15,000 at the end of the year? And they actually prefer it. Again, it's testing the psychology of the client, because that extra $100 a week, it goes out the door very quickly. As quickly as it came in, it's out the door. They'll find a way to spend it. But that lump sum, you just protect it that little bit more. So, I think you as an individual, when you are looking at, whether or not you should be choosing a PAYG variation, you need to really look at yourself and understand who you are as a person. Are you a person who receives more disposable income and finds a way to get it lost in the ether, or are you a person who loves to see lump sums come in and you protect it a little bit further? But, in the environment that we're in, Mike, it's a topic of discussion. It's a very, very open discussion that I'm having with many clients, really understanding, if they are in financial difficulties, or if there is a shorter string that they are living from. And this is a door that we have to open. And sometimes the PAYG variation is a necessity, not just for them to keep their investments, but for them to still maintain a normal quality of life.
Yeah, and I mean, you can have a big property investment portfolio, but be very cash flow poor, to the point where on paper you might look very comfortable, but day to day, you're struggling, right? I want to ask you, how would an investor go about doing this? You mentioned that it's a form. You make it sound simple. Perhaps it is very simple for someone like yourself, but is it something that only an accountant do? Is there a fee involved? How does somebody set it up? The Geared for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well.
Yeah, so PAYG variation forms are accessible for the public to do themselves. There is a bit of knowledge that's behind it, no doubt about it. It's not like just filling in a couple boxes and moving on. Generally, accountants do PAYG variation forms for their clients. We generally do a lot of them for our clients. I've got a very small handful that know how to do it themselves. But it could be something that a person wants to attempt to do themselves. And prior to lodgement, if they feel that they need someone to review it, that's when you reach out to a professional. If time's your issue, interpreting the data is your issue, that's when an accountant really can come on board and give you an assistance. There is a cost. Accountants generally will charge because it is time that is required to complete the PAYG variation application form. You've got to run through the various costs and expenses that you forecast to have, not just for work, but also for your investments as well. Generally, the time frame, once submitted, getting to your employer, I've seen it happen within about 2 to 4, sometimes 5 weeks. So my advice to clients is that, quite openly or early in July, if you can get that form being completed with a good forecast attached to it, that's going to set you up for a PAYG variation to take place at the end of July, early August.
Beautiful. Now let's talk about the forecasting. So you mentioned it's your personal tax, right? So you might have some deductions with the work that you do, like using your own car or laptop or working from home. Putting those things to the side and just looking at it from a property investor point of view, what are the main expenses that you need to schedule or budget for, and what's the best way to go about that so that we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul and we do get a roughly accurate estimate?
Yeah, beautiful. So what we do as I suppose a process is we'll always look at the last financial year as a comparison for the data. Now, generally speaking, we'll really quiz the client. What's the rent? Last year's rent was $450 a week. Is there a potential rent increase to happen this financial year? Yes, Jeremy, I'm thinking about increasing the rent to about $460 to $470. We'll go somewhere in between. Interest, we can almost work out, well, if the interest last financial year was at 5%, utilising a little bit of our nous, maybe financial savviness, we might say the interest rate might hit 6%, and we'll work on an average calculation. We know council rates generally move with inflation. We know water rates generally move with inflation. We know insurance generally moves about 7 times more than inflation. So we can always probably estimate that the insurance might be 25% more than the prior financial year. But these are the things that we really need to consider. Where we really need to make sure we look at the difference of you getting a bit more or a bit less back is land tax. So there are some PAYG variations I'm doing this financial year because land tax has shot up for a substantial amount of clients, especially people that are holding property here in New South Wales. Lots of bill shocks happened over the last month or so as people have opened their New South Wales Office State Revenue land tax letters. So that's something that we really reliably need to try to estimate based upon a council rate valuation. And we look at the client's circumstances if we believe or we think they're above the land tax threshold, because some of these amounts that people are getting are double, if not triple, than what it was last financial year. And that sometimes is, I look at land tax of the land tax I pay. It's nearly 30% of my New South Wales rental income.
Yeah, wow, that's huge.
So it's a substantial amount of cost walking out the door. So, for me, I need to make sure that if I'm doing a PAYG variation for myself, I'm estimating that to the best I can, because that could be the difference of maybe reducing the tax by a further $100 a week and then getting me through to the other side with still intact financially.
Yeah. And where do people sort of trip up in that land tax calculation? So, things like your interest, it's easy to figure out, property management fees, all the go-to sort of deductions that you might have. Land tax, I'm assuming, could be not there on the previous year, but you've gone over a threshold and suddenly it's something that you haven't considered. Is that a trick to be wary of?
Yeah, 100%. So the ownership of the property is very important. So how the person owns it, whether it's in their name, 100%, 50-50. getting a good understanding of the land valuation of the property. And again, you'll be able to see that very close to the commissioner's value via your council rate. So these are the things that you really need to be wary of. You need to, potentially forecast as property prices increase. You need to know what those thresholds are. You need to know where you sit in those thresholds. And that way you can make sure that this doesn't become a cost that is absolutely out of the blue. It's a cost that you can say, well, I thought it was going to happen. Maybe it was a little bit more, a little bit less than anticipated, but it's not out of the blue.
Yep.
No one likes bill shock, Mike, and especially as in PYG variation, we want to try to make sure we get it right from the start. We don't want to be lodging multiple PYG variations, confuses the tax office, confuses the employer, and ultimately potentially the employee loses. So you want to try to estimate everything up front and get it right from the front as well.
And ideally, underestimate and over deliver. That's kind of like a catchphrase here with our business, because we like to surprise on the upside, right, when we're giving estimates or something like that. But in this situation, you don't want to forecast too high, because if your deductions don't come through that amount, then that's where you get the bill, right? So do you find people being a little bit conservative and perhaps underestimating because they'd much rather be wrong in one direction than the other?
Mate, I get people most of the time wanting to overestimate the expenses all the time. Overestimate, yeah, it's a constant battle. We're trying to get them to be a bit more conservative. So, no, look, everyone wants to try to get as much money as they can, and they think that, the tax office is taxing me less, it's mine anyways. They don't realise that it needs to be paid back. But I try to encourage clients to steer on the conservative side, but let's try to get it as accurate as we can. The closer we can get to the true nature of your position, the better it's going to be for you, because ideally there should be nothing left to pay. There should be very little refund that you'll get, and it would have given you ample opportunity to hold that investment. But we try to stay on that little bit on that conservative side, just to make sure that the client 100% is not in a position that's payable. However, it is up to the client to make sure that if there are substantial changes in their PYG variation that's been lodged, we should go back and do a revision of the PYG variation. Yeah. Many clients fail to tell us that. They let things go, circumstances substantially change, and all of a sudden they're owing tens of thousands of dollars in tax because they haven't advised the tax office of the substantial change.
I'm assuming somehow it's going to be your fault as well.
Always.
You can take that as
you always point the finger where you can, Mike.
Yeah, exactly. Now, you touched on something before which made me kind of think about the time value of money. I can remember talking to a chief financial officer talking about, when they're paying their bills. I'm like, we like to try and pay it at 60 days instead of 30 days, even if the payment terms are 30. People don't get too annoyed, and that money's better in our bank account, than theirs. And I kind of think, yeah, that's great for corporations, but for small business, that actually is not a nice way to do business. But that concept kind of works for you as the investor, because if you're getting that money today rather than having to wait for it in the tax return, of course, with inflation, that dollar today is worth more than a dollar tomorrow. That impact, I'm assuming, is marginal, right? But when you're putting that value in, say, an offset account, that's where you kind of amplify the results of that, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. So, everyone's goal with an offset account is to try to have as much money as we possibly can for as long as we possibly can. And there's cheeky people. I'm seeing some really good methods out there. The clients are using credit cards, small balances, small limits, but using credit cards to pay for absolutely everything, making sure they're timing the 55-day interest-free transaction period and paying off the credit card in full. And the way they look at it is they've had significantly more money in their offset account, potentially for an average of 55 days longer than what they should have. And sometimes it's very crafty. There's a lot of tweaking that you need to make sure, and I'm sure a lot of Excels you need to update. But the fundamentals of it works. You're having a substantial amount more money in your offset account for a longer period of time, and it works very much similar for a PYG variation. You're getting the power of getting your refund now, as opposed to waiting, say, 12 months or 15 or 16 months later on down the track. But in most cases, that PYG variation that we are doing, in most cases, not all, it's there to compensate the cost. Where there is a major win is we get to do an estimation of depreciation in that financial year as well. And as we all know, Mike, depreciation is a non-cash deduction. So that is where generally the refund from the PAYG variation, or the reduced amount of tax from the PAYG variation, as a result from the elevated amount of depreciation that you've got to claim in your property, that's kind of money that generally can sit in an offset account. Yep. And if you weigh that benefit up, over the long term, depending on how many properties you've got and depending on how much depreciation you're claiming, that could result in thousands and thousands of dollars worth of interest being saved in your tax, in against your own home from the tax refund that you've received early from the variation. So it's a very crafty way to do it. But as I said, mate, I'm just the psychology of people. When I do this for them, I know that they're spending that money as opposed to saving it.
Yes,
and hence why I try to recommend and say, guys, wait till the end of the year. Let's get that big bulky amount, and then that's the buffer you've got moving forward.
Yeah, I guess there's pros and cons either side, but if you're disciplined and you forecast well, it could be a really good way to get a good handle on your cash flow and have that little bit of extra cash flow to hold on to those investments. So, of course, you need to get expert advice from someone such as yourself. Speaking of that expert advice, I want to say thank you for joining me today. Jeremy, always a pleasure.
Thank you, Mike, for having me again, mate. Take care.
Cheers.